Hi, welcome to another essay by AAA Simulator. Have you ever been part of a multi-million-dollar project that utterly crashed and burned? I have. Let's talk about failure. Around December last year, I was overworked to the point that my mind and body were failing. I live near the Arctic, and it was particularly cold that year, so I spent dark 20 below days in my office, desperately working on a project that was doomed to fail. I had a permanent eye twitch, stomach problems from constant worry, and an overuse injury in my wrist that resulted in tendon liquid bursting into a painful lump called a ganglion cyst. Every day, I woke up and worked myself to exhaustion trying to come up with solutions that were more and more erratic, and I was legitimately scared I was losing my mind. The thing is, I was supposed to be living my dream. I was designing, writing, and implementing quests in an open world game, and getting a decent full-time salary to do so. Only problem was half of my coworkers had given up, and the other half were in the same desperate, overworked state that I was. We were in this position because our publisher, Focus Entertainment, had cut our funding months before, and 65% of our coworkers were laid off as a result. I'd come onto this project as a writer, and now I was the de facto narrative lead because I was the last person standing. And did we come together to make an awesome game and save our company and our own careers? No. We failed, utterly and completely, and that multi-million-dollar project was cancelled forever, and our whole team was let go. Not only that, we were all set loose on a job market with thousands of other game developers, and not just indie developers like ourselves. People who had been working for decades at huge companies like Riot and Blizzard were right alongside me. AAA veterans were suddenly applying for indie jobs, and I was expected to compete with them for survival. In fact, I'd already been applying since the middle of 2023, and things were looking grim. I was caught in a constant loop of getting an interview, doing a technical test, reading another headline about a huge studio doing layoffs, and suddenly being rejected. This could have been the end of my career in game dev. It could have broken me. It almost did. I remember bleak mornings in January just sitting in front of my computer screen and panicking because Techland wanted a fully playable quest in 2 weeks just to apply for their quest designer position. And I knew I was going to fail. And then Blizzard and Riot did their layoffs, and I did fail to get that job. But I didn't fail at making the quest. I completed it despite being out of practice with Unity, despite never making a 3D prototype from scratch before, and it didn't break me. It made me stronger. It reminded me that I don't need a studio to make games, and it taught me never to let myself be exploited like that again. A fully playable quest, unpaid, just to apply to work at a notoriously awful studio? Bad form, Techland. Instead, a year later, I'm still making games, and I'm not losing my mind or ruining my body this time. In fact, I'm really happy even though I don't have a publisher for AAA Simulator, and I have no idea how well it'll do. But I think I'm lucky. It could have easily gone another way. I mean, I could have been hired to work at Techland. How cursed would that be? Joking aside, the only reason the whole ordeal didn't ruin me is because I happen to be close friends with failure. I want to tell you a little bit about that by telling you how I became a full-time game developer. The first game I ever tried to make was, of course, a failure. It was supposed to be a JRPG inspired by Final Fantasy III and Chrono Trigger, so there was a wild plot that involved time travel and a huge cast of characters and, of course, you had to fight God. There's not much left of it except the first sprite sheet I ever drew, which is still my Discord icon. I started making it with my friend because he told me about a deal where we could get GameMaker for free for life, and that's still pretty cool of them. GameMaker is great, you should try it if it's your thing, but I got bogged down in the programming part and didn't make it very far. That's not surprising. I'd spent most of my life until then being held back by imposter syndrome. I've always wanted to create worlds and stories for people to experience, but in the tier list of possibilities, making video games seemed like a pipe dream for someone like me. Even being a novelist was something that seemed unrealistic. I wrote 4 books before I ever started writing professionally, and I'd failed to even come close to getting an agent. But that experience, along with my grad school, were enough to make me aim for the more realistic goal of a non-fiction writing career. My imposter syndrome even tried to stand in the way of that, but in 2016, I finally felt like I could start showing my work to people because I had a kind of epiphany. I decided I wasn't going to let anyone stand in the way of me doing what I wanted to do anymore. I was just going to do it. That might seem obvious, but you can't deny that most people hold themselves back from life for some reason. And I was one of them. My plan was to pitch 1 non-fiction story per day, and I did exactly that. I probably annoyed a lot of editors by sending in political pieces on topics I knew nothing about. But I sent hundreds of pitches that year. I failed a lot. Most outlets just won't even bother to answer a cold pitch. Others send a form rejection, which almost hurts more. But in one way or another, I was rejected over and over and over. But I also learned a lot. And I even ended up not getting rejected and writing cultural pieces for the Daily Beast, South China Morning Post, Playboy, and more. I started getting game keys for free to write game reviews. And at one point I even worked for UNICEF, helping them with the narrative in their reports. Even though I became comfortable with failure throughout all this, my experiment with nonfiction also taught me that print media is dead. Journalists are underpaid and overworked, and I wasn't really doing what I wanted in the first place. I decided to do a very simple and obvious search that changed everything. I went to Google and typed in, "How to become a video game writer." I used my writing experience to apply to work on My Time at Sandrock, and I was actually hired as the lead writer. But it only lasted a few months before my friend Failure came knocking. The studio was weird and shady. One day they just ghosted me and the other writer, as I suspect they did to the writers before us, and the work dried up. Luckily, the writer I worked with told me about the interactive fiction competition and choice of games. I entered IFComp with a game that I actually finished coding on my smartphone, because I was staying in India and my computer got destroyed by a power surge. I failed to place above 16th, but that's better than 4/5 of the games that year. And some of those devs are veterans who come back every year. I also got a publishing deal with Choice of Games, and my first game with them, Battle Mage, Magic by Mail, failed to get higher than mixed reviews. Partly for things like daring to let you choose your own pronouns, in a Choice of Games title. But it sold well, and I was asked back to write another. From there, I failed at selling a mobile game which I made and published on Google Play. I failed at winning another IFComp, and I failed to get hired at many studios. Believe it or not, I was considered for narrative lead on Skull and Bones at one point. In fact, I've been close and failed way too many Ubisoft recruitments for someone writing a satire about the AAA games industry. At some point, I kept applying out of morbid curiosity. How bad is it really to work there? In an alternate reality, there's a version of myself that worked on Skull and Bones and failed in a completely different and spectacular way. I think you get the point. I've failed a lot, but along the way, many of those failures have doubled as successes. I've made a lot of games, some of which I love, some of which are traumatic to even think about, and virtually all of which involved failures big and small. And eventually I realized that through all those failures, I was making games full time. So this is where the story started. Me working full time at a studio that was killing me, on a project that was doomed to fail. But it wasn't the studio's fault or mine. In fact, it was Focus Entertainment that got too greedy during the pandemic and had to cut costs along with the rest of the game industry. So they pulled our funding. I'll say allegedly for legal reasons, but their revenue dips along with the rest of the industry are a matter of public record. Like I said, 65% of our studio was let go then and there, and I was one of the lucky few cursed to keep going, making a game that was now missing most of the devs that needed to be made. So on second thought, I'm going to say that's Focus Entertainment's failure. Not mine, but it still helped me just as much as all my other failures, because now I'm making a game inspired by those events. And if you haven't figured it out, it's called AAA Simulator, and it's shaping up to be a pretty cool tycoon roguelike. You could even go wishlist it right now if you wanted. Anyway, my point is, if you want to make games, make them. And do it as badly as you want, because that'll only make you better. Just keep going, and remember that nobody should own your art but you. Thanks for watching.